Good afternoon, everybody, and for Şebnem, I guess it's good morning, early in the morning.
Good morning.
Today, this afternoon, Şebnem Kalemli Özcan from University of Maryland will be with us. Everybody knows her, so to cut it short, let me announce the title of her presentation. It's Supply Chain Disruptions, Trade and Inflation. Şebnem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I wish I could have been there in person, but unfortunately I am in Minneapolis right now for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis conference to celebrate Bob Lucas's contributions to monetary policy, foundations of monetary policy, and actually presenting this work. So, and I'm very happy that I can connect to you early this morning to present our same work on inflation. This is a paper we did for the ECB Forum on Central Banking that took place in Sintra, Portugal, as of June 29, 2022, a couple months ago. And it is joint work with Julian Giovanni at New York Fed, Alvaro Silva, my graduate student at University of Maryland, and Muhammed Yildirim of Koç and Harvard. So let me just start with stating the obvious, that we are living in a period of inflation, but the shock, the COVID shock we have witnessed in 2020 has a lot to do with this inflation. That will be the punchline of our work and the summary of this paper. Since early 2020, the world economy has been hit by an array of demand and supply shocks. This is originally a health shock. Why it's the pandemic, why we call it a demand and supply shock, because it changed the demand and supply differentially across sectors, across countries, across time. So it is a very, very unique and different shock than what we used to in terms of a standard financial crisis or a business cycle shock. And of course, policymakers have responded because the economies have contracted very severely in 2020. So policymakers have responded aggressively using both monetary policy and fiscal policy. But again, this response have been different across countries. So what we have seen as a result of the pandemic itself and the policymakers' economic response to it is large swings in economic activity. We first saw a collapse in demand and GDP and a very quick recovery. Then the same thing happened, of course, international trade, simultaneously collapse and rebound in international trade. We saw a huge compositional change, substitution of consumption across sectors, from services to goods sectors, initiated with basically locking down all the services sectors due to the pandemic. And then the point we came at the result of all these huge swings is uneven labor shortages, the huge imbalance between demand and supply across sectors. And this is what we call supply chain bottlenecks and inflation. And the question to ask in this environment is, what should monetary policy be doing and how effective it can be? This is the question we are all searching answers for. And our argument in our work is that we have to understand and quantify the relative importance of forces driving inflation. So it's not just enough to say, oh, this inflation is driven by both demand and supply factors. How much is a very important question, because that answer to that, how much of the current inflation driven by demand and supply, goes directly to the heart of what monetary policy can and cannot do in this environment. Okay, so we are going to ask two questions here. How important were sectoral supply shocks in driving inflation across countries? And the answer here is going to be varying across countries, of course, but they are going to be important overall. So if you want to get, one message from my presentation is supply shocks initiated by the pandemic and then gotten worse because of the aggregate demand stimulus is going to play a big role in driving inflation across countries. We are going to be working here with the two-year inflation, 2019 Q4 to 2021 Q4. So we are not getting into 2022 on purpose because we don't want to capture Russia-Ukraine war and the energy shock associated with it as the only supply shock. That, of course, adds to this problem, But even without the Russia-Ukraine war, at the end of 2021, we were in a world where supply shocks are very important in driving observed inflation. Of course, the numbers are going to vary across countries. So qualitative result is supply shocks are important, but the contribution is going to vary. So we find that for 2019, 2021 inflation in the euro area, half of it can be explained by supply side, and for US, 1/3 of the observed inflation during this period can be explained by the supply side. Now, the second big important question here, how important were foreign shocks and bottlenecks? Because these, when we say supply shocks, supply chain bottlenecks, of course, this cannot be just, condensed in one country. You cannot look at this in silo just from a perspective of a single country. You have to think this globally. And of course, this is going to be an extremely important issue for euro area. So we are going to focus on euro area on this question. And we show that foreign shocks accounted for 2/3 of the observed euro area inflation. And again, this is the world before the Russia-Ukraine. So in that sense, it is very telling and it is very depressing moving forward. What is the situation going to be in Europe? How ECB will react. And of course, this is going to be very important for countries like Turkey, where European demand for Turkish exports is a very important driver. So we find that foreign shocks is going to be accounting 2/3 of the observed euro area inflation. And then the third question is, we are trying to bring together this trade side with the supply chain bottlenecks, because if supply chain bottlenecks are very important in driving inflation, and globally they have a role. When I say foreign shocks is 2/3 of the euro area inflation, obviously I'm talking about global supply chain bottlenecks. How come we have seen a very quick recovery in trade? What is going on there? How do you square these two observations, recovery in trade and then the persistent supply chain bottlenecks? Here, we are going to show you that the compositional change in consumption is going to play a key role. Because at the end of the day, when we say trade, we talk mostly about goods trade, manufacture, and merchandise trade. And because demand is shifted there due to the pandemic and the economic policies, that is going to be underlining the recovery in trade. But of course, given the supply chain bottlenecks, the right counterfactual here is that trade could have been even higher. So we show that trade didn't change as strongly with respect to GDP, which is basically looking at a trade elasticity with respect to GDP, when we look at the 2008 episode versus 2020, 2021 episode. What happened in 2008? That was your standard global financial crisis. There, actually, trade responded much strongly to GDP because there wasn't a supply chain bottleneck problem. So now what we are going to show you that the response of trade to the changes in GDP is consistent with the long-lasting supply chain disruptions. Let me start with some stylized facts first. That is going to initiate the stage for me to lay the groundwork of how the supply side, mainly labor shortages, feeding into intermediate input shortages, really pushed up the inflation. So the first figure I would like to show here is this figure of inflation and employment. So what you see here on the right for euro area and on the left for euro area and on the right for United States, inflation plotted in pink. This is headline inflation, but you can also do it with the core inflation. So the point here is not about, of course, headline is going to be higher than the core given the food and energy, but the point is not really looking at the level, but the timing here. So if you look at the timing when inflation start picking up in euro area, beginning of 2021, United States even earlier, last quarter of 2020, when that pink line, the inflation started picking up, the purple line is very, very flattish, not back to the beginning of 2020. That's employment in Europe, and in United States, you do the same thing. Employment rate, like the purple line, drop, and when inflation started increasing, the pink line here, you can see that the employment was not back to end of 2019 level. This is basically this, observing slack in the economy at the same time with inflation, which is why the standard macro models, standard central banking models are going to not just are going to have a hard time with this in the future, but did have a hard time with this at the time when you have still an unemployment issue in your economy, but inflation started rising. So that was the start of the problems. Okay. This is combined with the whole supply chain pressure issue. You can see that how supply chain pressures are important driver of inflation here. Again, on the left, I have Euro area. On the right, United States. The pink is the same inflation, headline inflation here. And the black is this New York Federal Reserve index of supply chain pressure. It is known as GSCPI, Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, which is now used widely. What is this index? This index is basically puts together based on a common factor dynamics model of variables like shipping times, delivery delays, freight costs, all these indicators of the supply chain problems that we all looked at. The index combines them, try to get at the timing of this issue. And you see at the end of 2020, all 2021, basically, how inflation and the supply chain pressure increased together in Euro area and United States. This original hump in this black line is due to initial Chinese lockdown. So China, of course, is going to be a big contributor to this global supply chain pressure index. But the point to make here is that the inflation and supply chain pressure increase together at the same time, which means if you look at trade and try to say, oh, supply chain issue is going to resolve very quickly, so we don't have an inflation problem, that would be a wrong thing to do, which many actually, academics, policymakers, institutions did this mistake early on, because quick recovery in trade told people that, okay, we are not going to have this persistent supply chain thing. This is going to be transitory, so inflation is going to be transitory. So clearly, trade is not the right metric here. And the reasoning is very simple. Trade is an equilibrium outcome, whereas supply chain pressures is exactly about disequilibrium, right? You are having a problem with demand and supply imbalances, which is why you have a supply chain pressure. Okay, looking at trade, it is actually important to note this heterogeneity across countries. So what you see across COVID and across, again, your standard demand collapse, financial crisis type of episode is going to be very, very different. So here I'm going to show Euro area imports and United States imports on the top, and the Euro area exports and United States exports on the bottom for two crises. The purple one is going to be the global financial crisis. So what we are plotting is the drop in trade during global financial crisis from its peak, and the x-axis is quarters, and then the pink is going to be the same drop in trade from the peak during COVID. I mean, you can see that COVID recovery for Euro area imports and United States import is much quicker, but at the same time, the initial drop, at least for Euro area imports, top left, and United States exports, bottom right, is steeper. This again shows you, and also the country heterogeneity and the difference between the previous standard aggregate demand collapse type of financial crisis is this unique nature of this crisis, the heterogeneity across sectors in terms of demand supply and across countries. And of course, the reason is this huge compositional change in consumption, and that is reflected in trade. So when you look at consumption, you are going to see this clearly, much clearer than trade. This is the private consumption data I'm showing you right now. So in fact, there was no decline in consumption during the global financial crisis. As you see at the top is Euro area real consumption on the left, and top right is United States real consumption. You see that the purple global financial crisis in 2008, consumption didn't budge at all, but the COVID, there was a huge decline in consumption, and then recovery, the compositional shift in that drop, and then the recovery is going to be extremely important to understand inflation trends. If you see the bottom figure here, we are decomposing the real consumption into durables, non-durables, and services, both Euro area, United States. You see that pretty much, they were all dropping. I mean, durables and services dropping at the same time. And then when durables, the purple line, start improving as of late 2020, services is actually going further down. And by the end of 2021, services consumption still has not improved in Europe. United States, a similar story, although everything starts earlier in the United States, the durable recovery started very strong much earlier, given the extent of aggregate demand stimulus in the United States, non-durables also, but the services took some time. And at the end of 2021, just back, maybe not yet fully, but almost back to pre-pandemic levels. This is going to be reflected directly in the inflation trends. If you look at this slide, I'm going to now plot headline inflation and core inflation on the top, and the bottom is going to be services inflation and goods inflation. This is going to be very, very important in understanding inflation and now moving forward, how we can reduce this inflation. I'm going to plot 3 countries: Euro area, United States, and United Kingdom. Euro area pink, United States purple, United Kingdom orange. You see that headline inflation is going to increase pretty much, early 2021 in all. Core inflation the same. Of course, headline is going to be a little bit higher than the core, but pretty much by the end of 2021, in all these countries, you are talking about levels such as 4 to 6%. When you look at the services and goods inflation, though, you see a very different narrative. In the bottom figures, you see that services inflation again at the end of 2021, where central banks has been criticized that they were too late to act. There was no services inflation. I mean, it's not even 4%. And in goods inflation, though, especially the United States, reached 10%. The Euro area reached, almost 8%, and United Kingdom is very up there. So very, very good inflation-driven inflation at the end of 2021 because of this shift in the composition of consumption, and that's because of the pandemic itself. That the primitive, the original shock is always the pandemic here. So how can we summarize this narrative? I mean, what are we dealing with here? So we are dealing with supply-demand imbalances on a global scale. And if you think about it, I mean, it is extremely hard to solve this problem in a single country with a single country's policy, right? Whoever's policy, call it health policy, call it economic policy, is going to affect each other through these global linkages, because demand and supply imbalances are going to be playing on a global scale. When COVID started, there was an original negative supply shock. Why? Just very simple. This is a health shock. People are getting sick. There were lockdowns. You are just creating a negative supply shock. Demand shock was relative from the start. Why? Because you basically lock down people at their houses. People are fearful of going out, going to restaurants, limited mobility and all that. So you are shifting demand from services to goods. But what happened after that, you start this world with supply chain disruptions, the huge economic response to the pandemic, the demand stimulus, done mostly through fiscal policies. That demand stimulus, this aggregate demand stimulus through fiscal policies, of course, put this relative shift in the demand on steroids, right? So you already were consuming more goods and less services. Now you have extra stimulus to consume even more goods and less services. So this is the story that we read many, many times in newspapers. People sit at their homes, order another bicycle, order another, car. The used car sector went to the roof in terms of inflation effects and so forth. This, of course, is going to end up with inflation. I mean, that's very clear to everyone. But what has been maybe overlooked is not just inflation, but making supply chain disruption worse. Because supply chain disruption never recovered when that stimulus came, and they end up being worse. So the fact of the matter is, you weren't doing wrong economic policies. Of course, the world is going to a recession, contracting. You are going to do stimulative policies, but the problem here was you are doing those stimulative policies in a supply constrained world. This never happened before. I mean, I guess the closest example you can give is maybe 1970s, but not even that, because that's a general oil price shock. This is not that. This is very specific to sectors, specific to labor, different timing. So it is a very unique and once in a lifetime type of shock when we did these economic stimulus to get countries out of the pandemic, opening, the vaccinations and all that. All that was done in a supply constrained world. Okay, so how then we can link all this to inflation? So I'm going to start first with a closed economy and then move to open economy. So clearly, given this sectoral nature of this crisis, and then given also the global nature, we really need to be thinking in terms of a network macro model, not a single sector, single Phillips curve type of macro model, which is our standard business cycle central bank model, but the network model. So we are going to make use of a multi-sector macro network model of Bakai-Fahri. This is a multi-sector. We are going to use 66 sectors here. This paper is published in American Economic Review in May 2022. It is a two-period model. And why this model is the right model to understand COVID-related inflation is because this is a model that is going to allow you not only all these input-output linkages, sectoral linkages, and network linkages, but it's also going to allow for realistic complementarities in production, which is going to be very important. You see in the picture here, it is not just about being a tradable sector or not tradable sector. It is color-coded here. Like, for example, computer and electronics is a tradable sector, construction is an untradable sector. It is in pink, but the linkages between the sector and the non-linearities between these linkages. So you can be a sector such as construction, but then you are going to be, linked to other sectors that are trading, or yourself is buying inputs from other countries. This is the story of the lumber shortage, for example, in the United States, when Brazil and Canada couldn't export due to the lockdowns and labor shortages. Okay. So the model is going to bring this in several layers of CES. So this is actually a 3-layer CES. What does it mean? This is basically you are bringing the consumption side and the production side together, and to really get at the issue of supply chain bottlenecks. What is a supply chain bottlenecks? In the model language here, it is basically complementaries in production, right? So when China locked down and when US is buying steel from China, US cannot go to Turkey and say, let me now buy this from Turkey in the short run. So this is what we mean complementarities in short run in production. Of course, this is not a new thing. This is not something we learned through COVID. We knew this before. Early work already showed us by Barra Sauvignon, by Atalay, by Bohem and all, that Douglas production is going to be super unrealistic in the short run. It is not going to capture difficulty in substituting among inputs and suppliers. And this is going to play not only in a closed economy sense, it is going to play also in an open economy global sense. So there has been a literature estimating these type of complementarities, what we call short-run elasticities, saying that you really need to go less than 1 out of the Cobb-Douglas world in the short run to capture all basically these elasticities, how labor is combined with capital, how intermediate goods combine with others, and how they all come together to produce the goods that the consumer is going to consume, and how every part is going to be coming from a different country. And that's basically what we call a lean global value chain, a global supply chain. Okay. We are going to focus on 2019 Q4, 2020 Q4. It is going to capture both collapse and recovery. So in that sense, it is very nice, and it is going to avoid the Russia-Ukraine. So we are making life difficult for ourselves. I mean, if you add the Russia-Ukraine, you are going to have even a larger role for the supply. But the point is, even without that, how far we can go. So this model is going to allow a very rich set of shocks. So you are going to have an aggregate demand shock, your standard discount factor shock, bringing the consumption from second period to first period, which is of course going to be a result of the stimulative policies. But the important thing is why it is a macro network model. There's many of sectoral demand and sectoral supply shocks that we are going to feed from the data to the model. What data is this? We are going to use sectoral consumption data that I already showed you the switch, how sectoral consumption switching from services to goods, and sectoral hours work data, because of course the sectoral labor is going to be affected from both demand and supply switch at the sectoral level. Okay, so the key intuition here, and this is not our model. This key intuition is, we turned this model into an open economy, but the original closed economy model is the Bakai Fahri AER May 2022. And this is an amazing paper. I recommend everybody to read this. The key intuition coming from the model is inflation in a macro network model is going to be a function of aggregate demand shocks. That's standard. That would be in any model. But the new thing coming from the macro network model is weighted observed employment changes for every sector. If you look at this equation, every sector out of that 66 sector labor is going to come here. So it is a very, very neat model to capture this real life labor shortages phenomenon, because labor shortages didn't start as an aggregate phenomenon. We started with the chip sector, semiconductor sector, then the used cars, then the lumber. So it's kind of like originally on and off. And that's exactly why a lot of us thought of this as transitory, because these type of sectoral supply shocks, productivity shocks, technology shocks, even demand shocks, they are sorted out with relative price changes. But this is a world now you cannot do that, because labor is not moving across sectors, and also the complementarities, because you're in a very short run, the complementarities are between production inputs and labor is very strong, and you just need to be dealing with that. So that type of real life phenomena can all be incorporated through this equation, and the which gives you a very nice sense of this. How can I have slack and inflation at the same time in the economy? Because this is very hard to think, of course, with the aggregate Phillips curve. You want to think like a sectoral, many different sectoral Phillips curves. So you have a potential labor for every factor. So you start pre-COVID, as in this figure, everything is one, and then pandemic happens. Just think very simple 2 period. So this potential labor is going to go down. So this L bar is going to go down, and that's the pandemic itself. That's the pure supply shock. But then, of course, there's going to be an employment level due to the demand and supply changes. And of course, there's also a downward wage rigidity in this model. The wages cannot fall. They can go up, but they cannot fall, which is going to, of course, give you unemployment, right? This is what happened originally, known as the Keynesian unemployment idea. There are other papers pushing this idea, like Veronica Gururi, Ivan Werning has a paper, Ludwig Straub, also in the same American Economic Review, last year's Jackson Hole conference, they presented that paper too. So the difference in the Bakai Fahri world is like you are doing it with many sectors, right? Which lends itself easily to empirical quantitative analysis, as opposed to doing just with 2-3 sectors, which is going to be harder than to carry to the data. And the key here is like you have this potential labor going down, the blue, and then the other one going also down, equilibrium level due to demand, but the red one can go up. The point is, of course, but until the potential go up, you can never increase the equilibrium level over that. And that's exactly how we are going to end up with these labor shortages, when the demand is increasing, but supply cannot keep up, and adding to the wage pressures and adding to the inflation. And then, of course, post-COVID world, you go back to normal. Okay, let me show the results, and then I'm going to conclude and I'm going to take questions. Let me start with Europe. So first on this slide, you see that what is, first of all, the actual number. The observed headline inflation in Europe from 2019 to 2021, the end of 2021, was 4.69. And again, I'm going to show you the headline results, but you can do the same with core. The qualitative result is not going to change. So this is the headline inflation observed in Europe. And then we first predict the inflation with the model, and we come very close. So the blue bar here, when we use the 45 sectors of the euro area economy, we are going to come up with something like 5.7. So the model matches the observed inflation. And then we back out the aggregate demand shock as a discount factor shock. That is in this orange bar, 3.2. And you see that sectoral demand shocks play a little role, but the sectoral supply shock, sectoral labor shortages, sectoral input shortages is going to play a big role. In fact, this 2.7, almost 3% of inflation of 5 comes from supply side. So this is why supply is very, very important in Europe, half. You can go to a 3-sector version of this, but the numbers are going to change. The message is going to be the same. 4.8 inflation, 2.7 comes from aggregate demand, 2 comes from supply. So the overarching result is that inflation would have been much lower in Europe without this supply shock side. In United States, similar story, although given the extent of fiscal stimulus in the United States being very large, aggregate demand is going to play a larger role here. So again, the observed headline inflation in the United States as of end of 2021 is 8.47. Our model is going to do a very good job, like matches something to 9 for 66 sector United States economy. If we do 3 sectors, it is also very close, 8.7. So that inflation, 6% is going to be coming from the aggregate demand. So all the stimulus, fiscal, monetary, everything done for the aggregate economy is going to be here. And then 3 comes from supply. Same when you use 3 sectors, almost 6 comes from demand, 3 come from supply, which is again, of course, 6% aggregate demand-driven inflation is not low. For the United States, it is high, but it would have been 6 as opposed to 9. And reducing 6 to 2 is, of course, much quicker and much easier than reducing 9 or 10 to 2. Okay, so that's our point here. We are not, saying demand is not important, very important, but 1/3 of the observed U.S. inflation is due to supply, which increases the inflation number, which is going to make, of course, policymakers' life very, very difficult. Now, open economy, I told you a story at the start that this supply linkages, supply bottlenecks global because the trade and production network is global. Here is a picture. This is actually from our paper with Selva Demiralp, Can Çakmaklı, Sevcan Yeşiltaş, and Muhammed Yıldırım on the economic case of global vaccinations, which we were making the simple point that if you want the supply chain disruption go away and things go back to normal, you have to get rid of the pandemic worldwide, vaccinate everyone. That's why we put it as the economic case of vaccinations, which pretty much turned out to be the reality. As you can see, China is still doing the zero COVID policy, and Chinese lockdown is affecting all of us in the rest of the world. And this is a figure that shows you in a simple way, there is this trade network, the trade relationship between countries in blue. And here the countries are color-coded as being less open, light blue, like US, more open, dark blue, like Ireland, size of the boxes, country sizes, and the thickness of the arrows is the volume of trade. But looking just at this figure is going to be misleading because this is not just final goods trade, it is also the intermediate goods trade. That's what the global supply chain, global value chain is about. That's why the figure on the right, the linkages between industries, which is generally told a very closed economy structural IO linkages type of thing, has to be embedded in this figure. Then it becomes exports and imports of not only final goods, but intermediate goods, and also it involves the non-tradable sectors, right? So the construction sector, wholesale retail, they are going to be affected all from lockdowns and disease in other parts of the world. And this is what you should bring in also when you try to understand inflation, especially in the euro area, because euro area, as you see, has a very, very special place, especially countries like Germany in the global supply chains. So, and this is actually the open economy version of the Bakai Fahri, which we did in our economic case for global vaccination paper. So here, for this inflation work, we use that model. But instead of using all these countries I showed you as in our vaccination paper, we are just going to look at 3 countries as we are focusing on the euro area and United States inflation. So euro area, again, United States, and everybody else is going to be in the rest of the world, because we would like to understand how much of the inflation is going to be important, especially for euro area. Those are the results I'm going to show you. So we are going to do 3 scenarios. Everybody is going to get the same demand and supply shocks, sectoral and aggregate. Only euro area is going to get these shocks, and only countries outside euro area is going to get these shocks, US and rest of the world. So what you end up with is, of course, this unfortunately very grim picture of euro area. And I actually think the ECB's job is much, much harder than the Federal Reserve at the moment because of exactly this picture. So when you have shocks everywhere, of course, you go back to this observed euro area inflation of 5% at the end of 2021. But you can see that if the shocks is only in euro area, inflation would have been 2, and they wouldn't have to do anything about it, right? Because of these outside shocks. Why? Because supply side is very important for euro area, and those outside shocks work as that and make the euro area import inflation. 3.2 comes from outside shocks. That means 2/3 of the observed euro area inflation is explained by shocks outside euro area. Okay, so the final thing I would like to tell you is, why we kind of fell into this trap early on that supply chain issue is going to be transitory, because we saw the very fast and strong recovery in trade. The increase in trade and supply chain bottlenecks happen simultaneously. And this is hard to square, because 2/3 of the global trade is the supply chain trade, right? How can one not be working and the other one is working? And this is exactly this erroneous thinking that supply chain issues will be transitory, which of course why people thought inflation will be transitory. Now, given the pre-pandemic global input-output linkages, the right way of doing is, the right counterfactual is, what are the expected international trade flows that follows from changes in final demand? And here we are going to rely on the work by Benz, Johnson, and Yee, who did exactly this exercise for the 2008-2009 crisis. And the main point here is, you see that for that crisis on the top panel, great financial crisis, these numbers are basically telling you very high trade elasticities. What is that? So imports and exports during the recovery from that crisis in United States and euro area responded 5 times, right? Like trade responded very, very, large sense to the GDP recovery. This is what happened in the data. Blue is data. And the model, this type of a simple model, is going to is going to have, of course, lower numbers because the models are going to be partially equivalent, but still it's going to give you elasticities larger than one or larger than one. So during the recovery, trade respond a lot. When you look at the COVID pandemic, actually, you see a very different figure. First of all, forget the model, the data. The blue is the data, United States and Euro area. You see that the numbers are much, much lower during COVID than the great financial crisis, which is saying trade didn't respond as much to GDP changes during COVID when we compare it to the GDP changes during global financial crisis. And the model also is going to give you the same thing, much, much lower numbers. And later in the paper, we show that intermediate goods trade is going to have a large role here, which again goes to the heart of the supply chain bottleneck issue. Okay, let me tell you the policy implications that I'm going to conclude. So aggregate demand stimulus in a supply constrained world has large inflation effects. This is what is coming out of all this work. And central banks, unfortunately, operate in an aggregate demand world. They don't have tools to deal with supply, sectoral or aggregate. But generally, how this world incorporates supply shocks is based on a Phillips curve one sector model that cannot handle a series of sectoral supply shocks, which can be temporary to a certain extent from a one-time permanent aggregate supply shock. So in a Phillips curve, when inflation responds to expected inflation output gap, if you want to incorporate a permanent aggregate supply shock there, that would be the potential output, right? You shock Y star, which is how people thought about the oil price shocks in 1970s. But this is not that, right? I mean, we didn't have this problem of the entire aggregate Y star going down, but we have these sectoral imbalances. So our argument is that you need a network model with asymmetric sectoral supply, relative and aggregate demand shocks, and nominal wage supply shocks and labor rationing in a network model goes a long way, accounting for labor shortages. And at the end, you have a cost push shock. It's a cost push shock going through wages, going through intermediate input. And the theory of this was, as I said, already done in the literature, going back to Lao Tahpasalai's work, Bakai Fahri, Gurere et al. Work. So what we do in our work is quantify the importance of this thinking for the current inflation problem in Euro area and United States. So again, to conclude, aggregate demand stimulus wouldn't have produced as high an inflation as the one observed in the data without the negative sectoral supply shocks. Half of observed Euro area inflation, a third of observed US inflation is driven by sectoral supply shocks. Limited factor mobility and complementarities in production played a big role in this, of course. If you can allocate labor at a global scale, then you don't have this problem. Of course, you cannot do that in the middle of a pandemic. In the short run, it is going to be extremely hard to switch between suppliers. So complementaries are very, very strong. I mean, these elements were there, but the pandemic made them just very, very stark. Because it's a global health shock, it is going to be very difficult for firms to reallocate labor between sectors, switch suppliers, domestic or internationally. This is a supply chain bottleneck issue and rising prices. A recent paper in this year's Jackson Hole by John Fernald actually show us that the relocation between sectors didn't happen at all. Labor relocated within a sector, but not across sectors. That goes to the heart of supply chain bottlenecks and how these macro network models think about these issues. So the belief that the rebound in trade observed in the COVID recovery period means well-functioning supply chain turned out to be misleading. We shouldn't be looking at an equilibrium outcome in order to understand a disequilibrium outcome. So I showed you much lower trade elasticities compared to 2008 crisis, highlighting the importance of supply chain bottlenecks. Euro area is more open to trade than the US. They have a very important role in the global supply chains. So foreign shocks played a large role in explaining observed inflation in the euro area. This was before the entire energy story. Obviously, if we keep having these shocks, supply shocks with the Russia-Ukraine, with the energy, with the food, it is going to be really, really dark situation for Europe, which is, of course, going to affect many emerging markets like Turkey. And monetary policy can tame it. So none of this is going to tell you that monetary policy cannot do anything, right? Because there is a demand component here. Monetary policy can tame inflation in a given country by contracting aggregate demand. This is, at the end of the day, is going to be a standard New Keynesian model. As in any of the other models, still with monetary policy, you can contract aggregate demand and you can reduce inflation. But reducing a 6% inflation with no supply shocks versus 9% inflation with 3% coming from supply shocks is a very big deal. In fact, the chairman of Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, said several times, including when I presented this paper in June ECB Sinter conference, is they want to give a chance to supply to catch up demand. That's why they are going to contract demand, right? So that is fine, and monetary policy can do its job. But the problem is there is going to be an upward pressure on prices as long as these global supply bottlenecks persist. So, and that requires, of course, getting rid of the pandemic, not adding to supply shocks like wars and so forth. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me, Şebnem Hocam? Thank you. Thank you very much. Now the floor is open for questions.
There is like a yankı var.
Yankı var.
Siz buradan konuşun.
Bilmem, ama yankı var hala. Now it's okay, I guess. Thank you very much, Şebnem Hocam. Now we can take questions from the floor or from the YouTube or from the Zoom. Do we have any question from the YouTube? No? From the floor? Ha?
Yok.
Ses gelmiyor.
Kime gelmiyorsun?
Çalışmıyor. Yani ben seni direkt izliyorum. Mikrofondan ses gelmiyor.
No mic. Now? Geliyor mu?
Şimdi başladı.
Okay.
Okay.
Soru alabiliriz. The floor is open for questions.
Sor.
Nazım. Yeah.
Direkt mi? Duyuyor mu beni?
Duyuyor.
Yeah, she hears you, I guess. Şebnem, can you hear Nazım? Nazım?
I didn't hear anything yet.
She didn't hear anything yet, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. So,
Mike. Technical problems.
thank you for the presentation. So what I understand is that
Nazım, sorry. Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay.
this new disinflation process will be somewhat difficult if, especially this Chinese disruptions in supply chain and Chinese trade position vis-a-vis the West continues. Disinflation will be somewhat difficult. Maybe average inflation targets will have to be, say, maybe 3% higher in some foreseeable future. Would you agree with that?
Yes, there is a debate right now in advanced countries. Should we go from a 2% target to 3% target? I mean, I actually think this is a very delicate issue because of the monetary policy credibility. I mean, at the end of the day, we know how important monetary policy credibility is. Emerging markets learn this the hard way. Advanced economies know this very well, and we are in an environment, very, very interesting environment, where people use the word credibility for Federal Reserve and European Central Bank. So that word goes with, anchored expectations and hitting your target. Now, I mean, once you start saying we are going to have a target of 3, I mean, then 4, then 5, I mean, so how do you do that? I think again, I'm not saying we shouldn't be going down that road. I mean, there are way more famous proponents of this than me. Olivier Blanchard has been a big proponent of this for a long time. And maybe the globalization, and now deglobalization should make us prompt to go to that world. It's a new structural world, but I think we have to be very careful on how we do that. I mean, this monetary policy credibility should not be risked at any cost, and this is exactly why Federal Reserve and ECB is tightening now, risking a possible recession, right? Because it is, price stability, anchored inflation expectations, and basically being at your target is why central banks exist. So in that sense, I think even we go to that world, it has to be well thought out before we think about it. Why 3 and not 4, for example? I mean, we don't have these type of models. I mean, there are now people working on these. What type of a regime switching we should be thinking, but yes, I mean, this is something that is hugely debated. And my view on that is, I'm not against this because I don't know enough about it, but my main point is that the monetary policy credibility is absolutely super, super important, and that has to be watched and guarded.
Hasan Hocam?
Thank you very much, Şebnem Hocam.
Yankı yapıyor. Tamam.
Now,
Yeah.
do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
Thank you very much. I'm Hasan Kanzalı, President of the Turkish Ekonomi Association. First of all, I would like to thank you for coming here and presenting your beautiful work. I would like to ask something to you. These supply shocks, do you have in mind the permanent ones or the preliminary, the tentative supply shocks? In the future, do you think the supply shocks will continue because of pandemics or some retreat from globalization or some other things or some conflicts between countries, or it is something temporary?
Yeah.
I mean, what we see now, the chip problem and the transportation, the increase in the transportation costs and loading and unloading times, and if something like climate change effects will be included, what will happen? What do you think about that?
No, this is a very, very important question. So these supply shocks resulted from the pandemic really taught us not to think of supply shocks something like permanent, happens one time and shift the aggregate supply in, right? That kind of very long run thinking. So that was the thinking we have. And in the old days, these things happened with wars, right? The entire German issue after Second World War, unification, oil price shock affecting the whole world. So we kind of tend to think, so they either, destroy capital stock in the economy, or if they happen directly on a price, it is going to be a temporary thing. So we are not trained to think these type of supply shocks that we observe due to pandemic. First of all, it is sectoral. Nothing is like really scarce. I mean, we didn't run out of labor or we didn't run out of chips in the world, right? But unfortunately, due to the fact that this is a health shock, and due to the fact that the production is concentrated on certain goods in certain parts of the world, this is the lean supply chain issue, we witnessed this problem. And it turns out that it is not transitory. I mean, it is still not also permanent. It is something between, right? It is not transitory because it's not a business cycle frequency. It didn't resolve in like 2 quarters. We are 2 years in it, but it is not also going to last 10 years, right? So it is this mid-world. But you are exactly right. If nothing else happened, this is going to go away. So in that sense, you are back to your transitory story. But if we keep seeing these type of supply shock, climate is a very big one. Another war is a very big one. Another, due to some sort of disruption somewhere affecting food and energy is another one. So, I mean, if we are going to a world like that and deglobalization, if we go to a world of deglobalization, we will go to that world, right? Automatically by construction, because globalization is actually one of the biggest force that kept inflation low in the last 20, 30 years. I mean, this is always, escapes from the closed economy macro people in US, but I say this all the time. I mean, as an international macroeconomist, we understand this very well. Globalization was a big force keeping the inflation down because now you have a pool of world labor, pool of world resources. You track that, you dial the clock on that, you go to a deglobalized world, onshoring everything, and that is going to be, exacerbate the problem. We are going to go to a world exactly like you're saying. We will keep getting these shocks, and energy and climate is going to be part of it. But it is basically the government's response, right? I mean, if US wants to get into this thing with China, by trying to isolate China, that's going to be a huge supply chain, actually. So I am a proponent of globalization. I think we shouldn't do this. We should find other ways of securing and diversification. Yes, I mean, I understand the geopolitical concerns here of every single government, but the answer to this is not going to a deglobalized world and to onshoring. The answer should be, we can do this better. So globalization 2.0, if you want to look at it that way. But you are exactly right. If we don't do this, we are going to be going down to a world of more and more supply chains.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Okay, then we thank Şebnem Hocam and have a good day in Minnesota.
Çok sağ olun, çok teşekkürler. Thank you.
Teşekkürler katkılar için.
Çok teşekkürler Fatih Hocam. Görüşmek üzere. Bye bye.
Bye.